Should we have term limits for Supreme Court justices? I'm Scott Ott with Bill Whittle and Stephen Green. This episode of Right Angles brought to you by the members at BillWhittle.com. And gentlemen, this was among the proposals that President Biden just made to try to reform the court. Another was to develop an ethical code for the court that would be imposed upon them rather than just letting them decide what their ethical code would be. And another had to do with presidential immunity. But we're not going to get into all of that right now. I found it interesting. A couple of years ago, President Biden used an executive order to create what is referred to as a bipartisan commission. Now, there are lots of people on this commission, and I don't know all their backgrounds. Most of them went to somewhere like Harvard or Yale Law or Columbia or a bunch of other schools. Anyway, lots of people on this commission. They interviewed lots of people, and his task to them was basically to study previous movements of court reform initiatives and evaluate them and study ideas that came up during those processes and give kind of pros and cons of each of those ideas. So this large report was produced by this presidential commission, and I've had an opportunity to read part of it. Now, I'm only, I think, into page like 117 or something like that. But Stephen Green, here's the basic idea. Right now, the U.S. Constitution says that Supreme Court justices can serve during good behavior, which basically means for life unless they get impeached. Okay? So the suggestion is, and President Biden would like to see something like this, that we would term limit them to something like 18 years. One of the potential ways of doing that was basically to give each presidential term 2 Supreme Court justice appointments.
They'd be staggered every 2 years,
yes.
Kind of like the Senate is, yeah.
Yeah, so this would rotate, and basically, the way it is right now, there are some presidential terms during which no Supreme Court appointments are made, and there are some in which 4 are made, and I think in some cases more than that. But it's interesting because
Washington got like 9.
Yeah, well, there are some things that have changed over the years that made me think, gee, is this a good idea? Now, the argument from the other side, from the opponent's side, to say no, term limits is a bad idea and we should stick with the Supreme Court justices for life, basically say, look, anybody who would want to change something that's been working for 230 years, the burden is on you to prove not only that it would work, but that there would be no unintended consequences and it would work better than what we now have works. And they have some other arguments to support the way it works now, but basically they're saying, it's your responsibility if you want to see this happen to make the case. Previous to 1960, the average Supreme Court term, this is, averaging them together, the average Supreme Court term was about 15 years. Since 1970, for justices that have been on the court since 1970, the average tenure on the Supreme Court is about 26 years. There is a lot of motivation, therefore, for presidents to find younger candidates to appoint to the court because they're going to serve for life. And therefore, if you want to make your imprint on the court, it's great if you get somebody who can serve 20, 30 years or more on the court. So, Steve, there are all kinds of factors that go into this, but just kind of on the surface, are you absolutely opposed to Supreme Court term limits of some kind just because Joe Biden wants them?
No, and although let's talk about Biden here for a moment, because there are a couple of things about this sudden pronouncement. He had been against reforming the Supreme Court right up until he was for it, and we know the reason. The Democrats the left generally has been hurt badly in the last few years with Supreme Court decisions, and magically they've adopted, we need to reform the Supreme Court for ethical reasons. Well, no, it's because you're not getting your way. We know this. But Biden has gotten a reputation as president because this is how the media sells him. We've got this kind of strongman image of the president, unfortunately, where if the president, well, generally, yes, where if the president gets his way with Congress, if he imposes his will on Congress and gets his legislation through Congress, then he is a good president because he he is strong men make will on Congress, which is a terrible way to run a constitutional republic with separation of powers, and it's a terrible way to judge a president. The press doesn't ask questions like, was the legislation constitutional? Did it do harm to the budget? Did it do harm to our rights as citizens and as taxpayers? All these? No. Did strong men get will through Congress? Terrible way to run things. And Biden has gotten this reputation as this master of Capitol Hill because he got all these big bills through his first 2 years of office. But there's no magic to it. There's no talent behind it. There's none of this legislative wizardry from the White House. All it is they loaded up these multi-trillion-dollar bills with enough pork to buy the votes. That's all there is, because since Obama got his trillion-dollar stimulus through, there hasn't been a shred of fiscal discipline on Capitol Hill. So Biden is a master of vote buying. Okay, great, whatever. Doesn't change the fact that with a Republican-controlled House, that his Supreme Court reforms are dead on arrival, which is, by the way, he said that the House Speaker is dead on arrival too, because Biden's just a mean old senile man now. He said it twice, by the way. He knew what he was doing. But about reforming the Supreme Court, if there were some actual horse trading to be done here, I might be interested, believe it or not. I would accept an 18-year term limit on a fixed number of 9 justices, including the Chief Justice, which that, by the way, that gives you that magic rotation of every 2 years that over the 18 you completely clear out, or you clear out each member. If it came along with some congressional reforms, for example, not just term limits, but age limits on members of the House and Senate. I would take that in a horse trade, and I would take the ethical reforms on the Supreme Court too, if it came with similar restrictions on Congress. Congress would have to follow the same laws we all have to follow. No trading if you're a congressman. All of these other things. Let's take a hard look at what really needs reform, and I think we'll find the Supreme Court maybe needs a lot less and Congress needs a lot more. And let's try pushing that through Congress. It's another reason why Biden's proposal is dead in the water. But there is a reason why it's written in the Constitution that justices serve during good behavior. The founders wrote it that way. The framers, I should say, wrote it that way on purpose because they didn't want Supreme Court justices influenced by the passions of the moment, or even the short to medium term. They wanted the justices to be isolated from that. And part of me says, you know what? If we accept these term limits, even without all the other stuff I just talked about, we would get, instead of 26 years of really crappy justices, at least, we'd get that down to 18 years of really crappy justices. But would I trade that for even 1 year less of a Clarence Thomas or an Antonin Scalia? No, I don't think I'd make that trade, Scott.
Steve points out this that Alexander Hamilton said in Federalist 78, and I'm loosely paraphrasing here, that that lifetime service guarantee, basically, during good behavior, is the best insurance we have against political manipulation by leadership or by president on Supreme Court justices. Basically, judicial independence was the goal. So how do you get judicial independence? Well, you make them not dependent upon the will of any politician. And my goodness, if Republicans don't know how this works, nobody does, because how many times have we gone in with great hopes behind a Supreme Court nominee, only later to find out that they didn't decide every case the way we would have decided every case. So, Bill, there's a lot of mechanism stuff that would have to happen for this proposal to even go forward. So we're really just at a high level discussing this notion. There is some suggestion by opponents that this would make, if you went to term limits, that each Supreme Court justice would be more of a political animal than they currently are, somehow, because everybody, it would be, okay, here comes a Republican president. he gets 2 picks or she gets 2 picks during this term. And so, they might even be able, Bill, to campaign in advance on saying, hey, if you vote for me, I will pick this person and that person to serve on the Supreme Court. Would that be a bad thing or a good thing for this republic?
Well, it'd be a terrible thing. Did you say I think you said you got 160 pages into that proposal?
No, not that
like
far.
That?
No, it was like less than.
No, I got to page 182, and so the stuff that you missed some of the details.
Yeah.
The details of the Democratic proposal are if the Supreme Court is issuing conservative rulings, then there shall be term limits, and the term limit shall be 3 weeks. But if, however, it's issuing liberal rulings, then it reverts to lifetime appointments. This is exactly what's happening, and we all know it. The left has socially engineered this country through the Supreme Court, starting in the 60s up until very, very recently. You don't need a democracy. You don't need to elect members of Congress. You don't need 435 congressmen. You don't need 100 senators. You don't even need 1 president. You need to convince 5 people to vote according to your political principles, and any laws that are passed that they don't like, they will strike down, and they will basically propose laws or do whatever they have to do to get that agenda through. So the Supreme Court has always been the left's ace in the hole. It's always been their ability to say, it doesn't matter whether the American people like our policies or not. It doesn't matter whether they vote for us or not. If we can convince 5 law professors to vote for liberal policies, then that's what will happen. That's how the game is played. So of course they want term limits now that they've got a minority. Of course they do. The second they have a majority, this idea of term limits will vanish. The same thing. Remember
now, Bill, would you say the same thing if they said, look, we have to transition to this if we put in place term limits, and it's not going to affect anybody that currently sits on the court? Would that change your view?
No, let me get to that second part of it. The first part of my argument was why they're calling for this. And we all know why they're calling for it. They're calling for it because the court is ruling against them now these days, and they don't like it. So they want to do something to force the court to be more, to increase the turnaround on the court, because they don't like the idea of having 5 conservative justices that are going to be on the court for another 25 years. But let me move to the second argument about whether this is a good idea or not. I think it's a terrible idea. And I think it's a terrible idea because of the structure of the country. We have a country that is let me rephrase that. We have a government that, as designed, is, I have yet to find a fault in its design. We have the ability to change the House of Representatives every 2 years. That allows the country to respond to immediate changes in the environment and what's going on in the world and so on. You could, technically speaking, flush the entire House of Representatives every 2 years. So that's our protection against short-term change. We have a Senate, which is a term of 6 years, which provides stability and prevents us from popular delusions and the madness of crowds. These people are supposed to be more grounded. They're supposed to be more experienced, maybe a little more prosperous, a little more in tune with not just how Washington works. The Senate is designed to slow things down. And then on the third extreme, you've got a Supreme Court who is by definition old-fashioned. It's supposed to be old-fashioned. It's supposed to represent values that are constantly under change and resist them. We under ideal circumstances, you would never change the Supreme Court. Because under ideal circumstances, you would have 9 individuals who are committed to interpreting the Constitution and looking at laws as they apply to the Constitution. You wouldn't need to change them at all. That's what their job would be, to determine constitutionality. So the idea of having to have term limits on these people is essentially a way of saying that we're going to be able to rewrite our national legal history every 18 years or 20 years or whatever their number is. When in point of fact, I very much like the fact that there are people who are looking at the world through the morality of 25 years ago or 30 years ago or whatever the case may be. Elections have consequences. The president appoints the Supreme Court. That's how it goes. It's worked well for us for 250 years. And I don't see any reason to change it other than the fact that the people who are calling for the change just don't like the court the way it is. And they're doing everything they can to make sure that they get their prime weapon back in their hands. And so they can swing their axe and chop down whatever aspects of our society they don't like and put in place new ones that nobody would vote for.
I want to applaud President Biden on setting up this commission to study the idea a couple of years ago. From what I've read so far, and I intend to read the rest of it, I just think it's pretty well written. It's pretty balanced. It looks at the pros and cons.
I couldn't put it down.
What's that?
I couldn't put it down.
Yeah, well, you couldn't pick it up. It's pretty heavy. It's a weighty tome. But anyway, it's an interesting analysis of the ideas, and I think in many ways illustrates why it is so difficult to make fundamental changes to the way things were structured in the U.S. Constitution. Because when the Constitution was framed out, it wasn't just something where a couple of guys got together for a summer at a beach house and said, hey, what do you think we should, how do you think we should run a country? These were people who were steeped in the history of governance, and some of them more than others, particularly James Madison, had really committed themselves to a study of all of the ways that men had tried to rule themselves and had found many of them wanting and had picked good things where they found good things and assembled them together. But they couldn't just assemble them together. They had to work with competing ideas of how that should work from a variety of states and different individuals who were part of this gathering. It was hard to hammer this out. And so to come along at any given point and say, hey, I don't think this is a good idea. I think we should change this. I think that the people listed in this report from the President's Commission who say the burden is upon those who want term limits to prove that these would be beneficial and they would not cause unintended consequences. The argument, by the way, from the proponents of term limits is, well, inertia itself causes unintended consequences. If you don't change something, that also causes unintended consequences. True enough, but it's a good discussion for the public to have. It's a good thing for us to think about, if only so that we will realize what an extraordinary gift we have in the U.S. Constitution. I think it does change if you go to term limits. It changes the entire nature of the court from whether it's viewed as more or less political. It almost doesn't matter whether it is more or less political. It matters whether the public thinks it is more or less political, whether it becomes a campaign tool. How, when you're on the Supreme Court and you know so-and-so is guaranteed to rotate off next year, is it possible that you withhold your support of a writ of certiorari to have a case come before the court? Is it possible that you try stalling tactics to make sure you give time for that person to rotate out before that even comes up? And so the gamesmanship within the court changes in ways that right now it can't. One of the arguments for term limits is that the current way is kind of random. Suddenly somebody up and dies or gets sick and can't serve, or just decides to retire. And that comes as a surprise. If they're just deciding to retire, there's the whole game of, is this a strategic retirement? To say, you know what, I want to make sure my president gets to choose the next person. I was going to retire sometime in the next 5 years. I think I'll do it now, to make sure that the guy who's in the White House now gets to fill that slot along with the majority in the Senate, for instance. So there are lots of issues to consider when you go about this. It should not be treated lightly. In the media, it will be treated lightly. This is why I don't just read the news story. This is why I say, oh, wow, there was a commission that studied this. I want to go read the commission's report. By the way, not the first commission that a president has ever appointed to study this. It's been done periodically over the years. And I was actually heartened to see that there are people who do this, who get together and have serious discussions and interview witnesses and talk about how these things should work. So if nothing else, I hope it gives some of our viewers an opportunity to say, you know what, maybe I should go take a look at that report. Maybe I should learn a little bit more about the U.S. Constitution. Maybe before these issues come to the fore and become actual proposals. Right now, the president is just saying things, but at some point, they have to figure out whether this is going to be a constitutional amendment, whether it can be done with statute, what elements of it can be done by executive order, for instance, and how can they put into practice these things that President Biden says he wants to see. My guess is that this is more than anything a rhetorical device on the part of a Democratic president to say to his base, we want to see changes in this court because obviously things aren't fair and just because, as Steve indicated, things haven't been going our way. So let me stand up and publicly call for reform of the court, realizing that the mechanism for getting that done is so convoluted and long-lasting that we will never see it. For Bill Whittle and Stephen Green, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks to the members at BillWhittle.com for making Right Angle possible.